80 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the debate over the atomic bombings still rages, often louder than ever. For some, the bombings were an unforgivable act of terror against civilians. For others, they were a grim necessity that ended the most destructive war in history. What is too often missing in these conversations is historical context. People today judge the decision as though it were made in a vacuum, forgetting the realities of 1945, the cost of the Pacific War, the choices on the table, and the world leaders facing them. Let's be clear. No one should condone the killing of civilians. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki should horrify us, and hope remains that all atomic weapons will one day be destroyed and never used again. But if we are to truly learn from history, we must confront it as it was, not as we imagine it through the lens of modern standards. The atomic bomb was a terrible weapon, but in the summer of 1945, leaders believed it was the least terrible option to finally end a war that had already claimed tens of millions of lives. The summer of 1945. By July 1945, Japan had suffered staggering defeats across the Pacific, yet the war showed no sign of ending. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had revealed the terrible cost of fighting an enemy determined to resist to the last man. On Okinawa alone, more than 200,000 people, soldiers, and civilians lost their lives, and kamikaze attacks sank or damaged scores of American ships. These battles served as a brutal preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would mean. The United States and its allies were preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Military planners estimated hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese dead, both military and civilian. Japan's government had mobilized civilians, including women and children, to fight with bamboo spears and improvised weapons. The expectation was not orderly surrender, but bloody resistance in every town and village. At the same time, Japan's military still held prisoners of war across Asia and controlled vast territories where millions were suffering under occupation. Each day the war continued meant more lives lost to forced labor, starvation, and brutality. Leaders in Washington faced a grim calculus. Prolonging the war meant mass slaughter on a scale that dwarfed even the bombings already carried out against Japanese cities. It was in this desperate context that the decision to use the atomic bomb was made. For the Allies, the question was not whether civilians would die. Civilians were already dying by the hundreds of thousands, but how to bring about an end to the war as swiftly as possible. Myth number 1. Japan was ready to surrender. One of the most widespread beliefs today is that Japan was on the verge of surrender before the atomic bombs were dropped. People often assume the Japanese government recognized the inevitability of defeat and were simply waiting for an opportunity to give up. The historical record tells a very different story. Japan's leadership in 1945 was fractured. A small peace faction existed, but it was outweighed by military hardliners who insisted on continuing the fight. They hoped to secure conditional terms, such as preserving the emperor's power and avoiding occupation. To them, surrender, as the Allies demanded, unconditional and total, was unthinkable. Even after Hiroshima was destroyed, these divisions paralyzed decision-making at the highest levels. Intercepted Japanese communications, known as the magic cables, show that Tokyo was seeking Soviet mediation, not surrender. The hope was that Moscow could help broker a negotiated peace that would preserve parts of Japan's empire and protect its ruling system. This was not acceptance of defeat, it was an attempt to avoid it. Far from preparing to surrender, Japan's leaders were buying time. It was only after the second bomb fell on Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war and invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria, that Emperor Hirohito intervened. Even then, elements of the military tried to stage a coup to prevent surrender. The idea that Japan was ready to give up before Hiroshima is not just a myth. It is the opposite of what the evidence shows. Myth number 2. The bomb was worse than anything else in the war. Another popular belief is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented a uniquely horrific level of destruction, far beyond anything else in the Second World War. In truth, while the atomic bombs were unprecedented in technology, their effects were tragically in line with what strategic bombing had already inflicted on cities across Europe and Asia. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in a single night than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. Entire neighborhoods were consumed in firestorms, with more than 100,000 civilians perishing. Other Japanese cities such as Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama were devastated in similar raids, as were German cities like Dresden and Hamburg. By the summer of 1945, civilians across the world had already endured unimaginable destruction from conventional bombing campaigns. What made the atomic bomb different was not the scale of casualties alone, but the speed and symbolism of its impact. One bomb, delivered by a single aircraft, erased a city in seconds. That shock value, its demonstration of a new weapon, unlike any seen before, was decisive in breaking Japan's resolve. But to suggest Hiroshima and Nagasaki were worse in moral or human terms than the firebombings already underway is to misunderstand the wartime context. The world rightly recoils at the thought of nuclear destruction, but in 1945, the atomic bomb was viewed as a continuation of existing strategies, not a sudden escalation. Leaders saw it as a more efficient way to achieve what conventional bombers were already doing at a slower, bloodier pace. Myth number 3. Japan didn't deserve it. They were victims. In modern retellings, Hiroshima and Nagasaki often frame Japan primarily as the victim of atomic warfare, with little mention of the years of destruction and atrocities Japan itself had unleashed across Asia. While the suffering of civilians in those two cities was very real and deserves remembrance, the broader context is critical. Japan was not an innocent bystander dragged into war. It was the aggressor that ignited the Pacific conflict and committed some of its worst crimes. From the rape of Nanjing in 1937, where hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were slaughtered, to the Bataan Death March in 1942, Japanese forces committed acts of mass brutality. Civilians across China, Korea, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia endured massacres, forced labor, and systemic starvation under occupation. Unit 731 carried out grotesque biological and chemical experiments on prisoners, with little regard for human life. These atrocities left deep scars across the region, some of which are still remembered bitterly today. Nor was Japan unfamiliar with bombing civilians. Long before Hiroshima, Japanese aircraft had rained destruction on Chinese cities such as Chongqing and Shanghai, deliberately targeting non-combatants. In Manila, Japanese troops massacred tens of thousands of civilians in early 1945 as the Allies retook the city. For people who lived under Japanese rule, the idea that Japan was simply a victim is impossible to reconcile with lived experience. This does not mean that civilians in Hiroshima or Nagasaki deserved their fate. Innocent men, women, and children bore the brunt of the destruction, just as in every other city bombed during the war. But the narrative of Japan as a purely passive victim erases the wider reality. A nation whose government had led it into a brutal war of conquest, one that inflicted mass death long before atomic bombs were ever conceived. Myth number 4. Dropping the bomb was a war crime. Another frequent claim today is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were war crimes. People often apply modern legal and ethical standards backward, assuming that such actions were already prohibited in 1945. But at the time, strategic bombing of cities was standard practice used by every major power in the war, including Japan itself. By the prevailing standards of the era, the atomic bombings were not outside the accepted rules of conflict. The German Luftwaffe bombed London, Warsaw, and Rotterdam with the intent of breaking civilian morale. Japan bombed Shanghai and Chongqing in the 1930s, deliberately targeting population centers. The Allies firebombed Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo, killing tens of thousands in single raids. By the time Hiroshima was attacked, more than 60 Japanese cities had already been devastated through conventional firebombing. Civilians had been made central targets of modern warfare years before August 1945. International law as it exists today, with prohibitions against targeting civilians, was not fully codified until after the war. The bombings may shock us morally, but they did not violate the laws of war as they were then understood. For military planners in 1945, they were simply a continuation, albeit with a new weapon, of an already established strategy. The sobering truth is that by the summer of 1945, every available option involved mass civilian death. Continued firebombing, invasion, and blockade would all have killed civilians by the hundreds of thousands. The bomb ended the war in 6 days, sparing the drawn-out starvation, destruction, and slaughter that a conventional campaign would have ensured. Myth number 5. A demonstration would have been enough. A common suggestion is that the United States could have simply demonstrated the atomic bomb on an uninhabited island or remote area, forcing Japan to recognize its power without killing civilians. On the surface, this seems like a humane alternative, but in practice it was deeply impractical and unlikely to succeed. The stakes of ending the war could not rest on a theatrical display. For one, the United States only had a handful of bombs available in the summer of 1945. If a demonstration was attempted and the weapon failed to detonate properly, the credibility of the technology would have been destroyed, giving Japan confidence to continue the war. Even if it worked flawlessly, Japanese military leaders might have dismissed the blast as exaggerated propaganda or insisted that without proof of its effectiveness against an actual city, it was no cause to surrender. Japan's military culture at the time valued sacrifice and endurance over capitulation. Leaders had already accepted the deaths of hundreds of thousands in firebombings without conceding defeat. There was no guarantee they would be moved by a display over an empty ocean or desert island. The bomb's decisive psychological impact came precisely because it erased Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, proving instantly that Japan's cities were vulnerable to total destruction unlike anything they had faced before. Even Emperor Hirohito, in his surrender broadcast, directly cited a new and most cruel bomb as the reason the war had to end. The bombs shocked Japan's leadership into action in a way a demonstration almost certainly would not have. As tragic as it was, the destruction of actual cities forced a decision that spared millions of further casualties. Conclusion: the least terrible option. Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain tragedies of the highest order. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children died in moments, and many more suffered from burns, radiation, and long-term illness. Nothing can erase that human cost. But history requires us to confront the reality of 1945 as it was, not as we might wish it had been. The Allies faced choices that were all terrible: invasion, starvation, firebombing, or atomic destruction. The bomb was chosen not because it was moral, but because leaders believed it would end the war fastest and save the most lives overall. 80 years later, debates still rage over whether the bombs were justified, and they should, because questioning the ethics of war is essential. Yet we must separate evidence from myth. Japan was not on the verge of surrender. The bombs were not uniquely worse than other destruction already taking place. Japan was not an innocent victim without responsibility for its own war crimes. The attacks were not a war crime by the standards of the day, and a mere demonstration would not have ended the conflict. These are not interpretations. They are facts drawn from the historical record. Let's pray that no nation will ever again use nuclear weapons. Their power is too indiscriminate, too devastating, and too enduring in its consequences. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki should serve as a permanent warning of what humanity is capable of at its worst and a reminder of the urgency of nuclear disarmament. But when we look back at 1945, we must resist the comfort of easy myths. We must understand the choices as they were, in the shadow of a global war that had already consumed tens of millions of lives. History does not absolve the bomb, but it does explain it. 80 years on, the lesson is not that the past was simple, but that it was impossibly complex, and that leaders made decisions in the hope of ending a nightmare, even at the cost of unleashing another.